Over the past few videos, we've been setting up an ASP.NET Web API server that has authentication based on JWT's JSON Web Tokens. And then we started using that, but we were only using it really through Swagger, which is a tool for developers to help us develop the Web API, but it's not something that a real user would use. So let's actually put a real front end on this, and we can do that in all sorts of different technologies, but the first thing I'm going to do is do that in Angular. And so if we take a look at what I've got running here, you can see that I've already got this Angular application running, and we've got a couple of the endpoints from our Web API web service. So we've got the all reviews, we've got the summary, and I've also put together a login page, but there's no functionality behind that there. That's just taking in the data. What we're going to see in this video is how we can make all of that work. Now, just a couple of things to say about the server itself. If we look at the code for that, I've made a couple of changes. One is I've had to add cores onto the server, cross-origin resource sharing, because we're now accessing this service from a website that's been served up from a different server, and so you've got this issue of cores. We talked about cores on an earlier video quite a way back, so have a look at that if you want a bit more detail. Just has to be said, this is very, very relaxed in terms of the rules of cores. Just to get it working, you should probably be a bit stricter than allowing everything through. The other change I've made is on the controller, I actually temporarily commented out that authorize attribute, which is why we can currently, on the front end, actually access the data, even though we're not logged on. So let's change that one. So we'll stop that, put that back on, run it up again, and we get the Swagger, but we're not interested in that. We're looking at the real front end. And now in here, we'll see that if I try and look at either of those, we're getting an error, failed to retrieve data. Let's take a quick look at how that's working in Angular. And so what I've done is I've created this book review repository. And if we look at the code for that, it's injecting the HTTP client. And then we've got a couple of methods, get reviews and get summary for those two pages. And they use the injected HTTP client to go to the endpoints on our web service. We've got the actual route there just set up in the environment by way of configuration. And as we saw again in many earlier videos, that returns an observable of the array of book reviews that we're getting back. We've then got the reviews component, and what that does is it reads in some data from the root, which is either going to be summary or it's going to be all. That's what we're defaulting to. So we can use the same component to either call the get summary or the get reviews that we just saw on that injected repository that we've got up there. And then we do a bit of configuration of that. We do some sorting. We blank out the error message, and then we have a catch error, and that's where we're getting that failed to retrieve data. So I'm not looking in very much detail at the error. We can actually see what's going on if we look at the console there. You should see if we bring up the console and look in there, there's the more detailed error that it was a 401. Not quite sure why it's giving us an OK there, because 401 is not OK, but it's definitely 401. It's definitely failing on that. And then finally, just in the template for that, there we've got the table that is hidden if there's an error message, loops through the reviews on the observable, and then we've got the error message at the bottom. So that's just the basics of it working. Nothing new there. Various early videos to look at to see how that works. Now let's get our login working. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add an authentication service. So at the moment, if we look at the login component, we've got the login method, which is what's being called when we submit the form. We can see there. And we've got the username and the password that are bound to those fields on the form, but we need to get this working. So what I'm going to do is create a new service. So I'm going to do ng, G for generate, service is the type of thing I want to generate, and I'm going to call this authentication. And then I'm going to say flat equals false so that it gets its own folder. If you don't put that on there, you'll just get it in the main app folder and it gets really messy on a big application. So we'll do that and let it generate that code. And then if we go in there into that authentication and have a look at there, we've just got that basic service put together. So what do we need on there? Well, the first thing we're going to need is to have a login method. So let's put that in there. We're going to call it login, and it's going to take the username, which is going to be a string, and the password, which is going to be a string, and it's going to return an observable for a date. If you remember what we got back when we log in to our server, we get back the JWT, and we also get the date time telling us when it's going to expire. So we're going to display that expiry time, and that's why we're coming back with the date. We need to get hold of the import for that, so that's easy enough. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to need to make use of the HTTP client so that we can talk back to the server. So that means in our constructor, we're going to have a private, just call it HTTP client, of type HTTP client. We've already configured that in the app module because we've already been using that for the review repository that we were looking at to get the data. So that's fine in terms of that. So that's what we've got there. And so now we've got to make a request on that. And we're going to do a little trick that I always do when I'm working with observables. Although ultimately we want to return the observable, because the type of an observable keeps changing whenever you do a pipe operation on it, it gets quite confusing in terms of the errors. So I find it much easier to actually just create a local variable so we can see what type it is as it goes by. And then once we've finished this off, and that will be of type observable for date, then we can just return it instead. But it just makes the coding a bit easier. So I'm going to say equals this dot HTTP client. So there's the HTTP client we injected. And then remember it was a post. So we can always check up with the Swagger to see that this is going to be the login and we've got the post there. So all that data is there if you want to look it up. And so it's going to be a post. It's going to return. Well, we've actually got to put in a class and we're just going to, in here, in this DTOs folder where I've already got the model for the book review, let's just add a new file and we're going to call this login response.ts. And in there, we're just going to say export interface login response. And that's going to contain the JWT token, which is going to be a string, and also the expiration, which is going to be a date. And that is just mimicking the structure that we had in our C#. So over here, if we take a look at the login response there, exactly the same thing. It's got the JWT token expiration. So that's going to be serialized to JSON and then deserialized back in our front end. And so in the authentication service, that's going to be the return type from the post. Then we're going to need to put in the URL. So we can get the basic URL from our environment file. So down here, you'll see we've got the environment. And so that's just taking us back to our development server. So we can in here just say environment.server URL. And then onto the end of that, we say /API/authentication/login. So that's the path we had there. And so that's the basic path. We then have to pass in the parameters, and remember what we're taking as the parameters going in there. Again, we can look at this in the C# or in the Swagger, but we can see that we've got the login model, and that's just the username and password. And actually, we don't really need to create a type for that in the TypeScript. We can just do that on the fly. So we've got a second parameter in here, which is just going to be username and password, which are the parameters coming into this login. And by the magic of JavaScript, that will create an object with properties of those names. So that'll work fine. And then if we just take a look at O, we can see it currently is an observable of login response. And this is the problem I was saying earlier. It's not yet of the right type. So it gets a bit confusing if we try and return it. Because what we're now going to do is we are going to put some pipeable operators in there. And I'm going to do a couple of things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to map that, get hold of the import for map, and then I'm going to say R for response gives R dot, and then we wanted the expiration. And so that now means our O is of the right type. It's the observable for date, which we have there. But we've also got to do something else. We've also got to record the JSON Web Token because we're going to be sending that back in future requests. Now, that raises the question, where do we store it? There's a number of options for this. You could simply store it in memory, so as a variable within our Angular application. The problem with that would be it would be very, very short-lived. If you did a refresh on your browser, that would reload the application and you'd lose all the data and you'd have to log in again. You could store it in a cookie, and that used to be done a while ago, but that's a bit unnecessary because cookies get sent back and forth between the server and the client, and we don't need that. We just need to store this on the client. And so in more recent HTML, we've got a couple of options for that. We've got either session storage or local storage. which actually store them in the browser and are accessible only by applications that are running on this website. The difference between them is that when you do local storage, it persists even when you shut the browser down, whereas session storage, although it will persist over a refresh or anything like that, if you actually close the browser and reopen it, you lose your session storage. And I think that's probably the best one to go with. It's a bit irritating because it means your login won't persist for very long, but it's safer because if you're on a public machine and you forgot to log out, even if you shut down the browser, somebody else could come along, go to the same site and use your authentication. So we're going to store it in session storage. So what I'm going to do is put a property on this authentication service, which is going to allow us to read and write the JWT into session storage. So the very first thing we'll do actually is just declare as a constant the key we're going to use in session storage. So I'm going to say private, static, read only, and then we're going to just call this key, and we're going to just call it the JWT key. So that's how we'll identify this particular item that we're storing in session storage. Then I'm going to have a get property. So we'll do get JWT, return string, and then that's simply going to say return, and then session storage dot get item. Then we put in that key, so authentication service dot key. And then we've got a slight problem that if that's empty, it'll send back a null string. So we'll just change that to a blank if it's empty. We're then going to have a setter. The setter we're going to make private because we don't want outsiders to do this. We're going to call it again set JWT. It's going to take a value, which is going to be a string, doesn't have any return. And this one we again say session storage. And then this time we've got a set item. And again, we can take that key and also pass the value. So there we've got a getter and our setter. And in this pipe, we're then going to use a tap, which remember doesn't modify the observable. It simply does something as it's being processed. And so in there we say r-gives, and then we can just say this dot JWT equals r dot JWT token. Okay, so that's going to be calling the setter and therefore storing it into the session. So we've got the two items of information on the response. We've got the token that we're storing and we've got the expiration that we're returning. And so now that's all working. We can simply change that and put the return in there and the type matches up and that works fine. And then finally, all we need to do is hook that up to the login component. So simple enough here, we need to give this a constructor and we're going to inject into that our authentication service of type authentication service. And then in the login, we can say this dot authentication service dot login and then just pass in this dot username and this dot password. So all easy there. Now that of course is not going to do anything as yet because we haven't actually started observing that observable. And remember, one of the key things about observables is they do nothing until you actually subscribe to them in some way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put on here a public field called expiration, and I'm going to put $1 on the end of there simply as a naming convention so that we know that this is an observable, and then I'm going to type it to be our observable of date, and then also I'm going to put a question mark on there because it's not going to be immediately there, and so we've got to give it the option of being undefined. And then all I've got on here is say this dot expiration equals the result of the authentication service, which remember was that observable of date. Then in the HTML, I'm just going to start consuming that. So what I'll do here is down the bottom, I'm just going to put on a paragraph, and I'm going to give this a star ng if, and then if that expiration exists, so just put that on there. And then in there, we're going to say you are logged in until, and then we'll bind to the expiration. So we'll have our expiration $. Then because it's an observable, we use the async pipe. And then also because it's a date, we'll use the date pipe and configure that to a predefined one called long time. So it'll give us the full time, but not the date on there. And so that should display the result. And then the other thing we'll do is on the form itself, let's disable that if we've got that expiration dollar. So once we've clicked the login button, that's when we'll get the expiration set to being defined, and so that should all work. So if we save all of that, and that looks like it's built successfully. So if we now go up here, go to the login page, and remember the username was Jasper Kent, and then $$W0RD with a password, log that in, and you can see what happened there. The result appeared, you are logged in until, but then there was a slight delay because we had to get the result back, and you can see that's set to 3 hours from now because that's what we set in earlier videos as the expiration. And what we can also see is if we bring up the dev tools and look in application and go to session storage, there you can see we've got the JWT stored under JWT key, which is where we put it, and so that's all worked fine. So we've managed to log in. Now we've got to use that JWT and send it back on the other requests so that when we do these things, we're not getting the 401 coming in there. So that's the next step to do. And we do that with an Angular feature called an interceptor. And that means that rather than having to set up the header containing the JWT specifically on each one of the calls, so in the book review repository, we'd have to set it up on this get, and the more calls we did, the more fiddly that would get. But with an interceptor, we can just define a way on every HTTP request to have some modification done to the request, in our case, putting in the appropriate header. So that's what we're going to do next. So what I'm going to do is add a new folder that I'll call Interceptors. And then in there, I'm going to have a new file, which I'm going to call JWT Authentication Interceptor.ts. And then we can start putting our interceptor in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this as injectable. So we just put @injectable on there to use that decorator. And then it's going to be an export class and JWT Authentication Interceptor. And that implements an interface called HTTP Interceptor. And then let's implement that interface. So there we've got the intercept method, which is going to do all the work. But then another thing we need to do is we're going to need to use the authentication service that we just wrote, which is where we get the JWT from. So we're going to put on here a constructor that's going to have a private authentication service of type authentication service. Okay, so that's what we've got in there. Now we can see on this intercept we have a couple of things happening. We've got the incoming request, and then we've got the next, which is the handler. So the idea of these is you may potentially want to build up a chain of them, each of which does its own little bit to the request. So the request comes in, we do whatever we're going to do with it, and then call the next so that it can do its processing as well. So what we're going to do in here, we're going to need to do a couple of things. Firstly, we've got to check that we're actually logged in at all, because if we're not logged in, then obviously we can't send anything. So we're going to actually have to put onto the authentication service another property that is going to tell us that. So what we're going to do here is very simply just have a get is logged in. It's going to return a boolean, and then all we're going to return is not this .jwt. So that not is getting around the problem that the JWT is a string. Now, although a string can be truthy or falsy, that's to say a null string or an empty string is falsy, the type wouldn't work for that. So by doing not, you can turn something that's truthy or falsy into something that's true or false and is therefore a boolean. So there is our is logged in. So back in the interceptor, we're now going to say const is logged in equals, and then this dot authentication service dot is logged in. Another thing we need to check is that we're actually sending this request to the appropriate server that we're logged into, because if this website got complicated, it could be using all sorts of different web services. We don't want to be sending the JWT for one web service to a different one. That would be disastrous in terms of security, because they could then use that to get into the other web service. So we're going to say const is to server, and then this one we're going to get off that request. So we can say rec.url and then .starts with, and then from the environment, we can get that server URL again. And so that's checking that we're going to the one that was configured for the requests, and so we can make sure. And then having done that, we're now going to say if is logged in and is to server. So we only want to be putting these in under both those circumstances. And then what we have to do is we say rec equals rec.clone. So we don't modify the request directly, we actually make a copy of it. But then with this clone, we can define what the modifications are. And what we're going to do is we're going to say set headers. And then what we're going to set is the authorization header. So just the same as we saw we were setting in Swagger or in Postman in the previous video. And then we say, remember, bearer space, exactly as we did before. And then we put in the key. So we're going to say authentication service dot JWT, and that will be the JWT that we've already set up. So that's modified it if necessary. And then, as I said, all we need to do is call the next one. So we simply say return, and then on that next that's been passed in, we say .handle, and then just pass the request through. And so that will do all the things we need to do. So that's our interceptor doing what needs to be done. Last thing we've got to do is register that interceptor. So in the app module, in here, where we've got our providers, so we can see we've already got the repository service in there. The authentication service, I should just point out, we did by just leaving that provided in root, though you'd probably have wanted to be consistent to put it all in the app module. But certainly for this one, what we need to do in the app module is we say provide, and then there is a predefined token, which is HTTP interceptors, and then we say use class, and then the name of the interceptor that we've just created, so our JWT authentication interceptor. The other thing we put on here is multi-set to true. That's to basically say we can have multiple injected objects for this token HTTP interceptors. Because remember I said you might want to have multiple ones doing different bits of processing to your request. So because we've said multi, we could put multiple ones in there, and they would be chained together in the order that they were declared in this providers list. So if you want to do something like that. But having done all that, that should now be working. So if we do our save, and we can actually see that is already working because, remember, our JWT was stored in the session. We haven't actually closed down the browser, and so we've still got that in there. But if I were to, well, the easiest way is just to delete that one. And so now we'll see that we're getting the failed to retrieve data. But now if we log in, once again, we've got that in there, and now we're getting those reviews and those summaries. And if we just take a look at the dev tools in there and go to network and just do another request, then we can see that summary coming in there. And if we click on that, scroll down to the request, and we can see there's the authorization header that's been sent with that bearer token. So that's all of that basically working. We've provided a login component. We're storing the JWT in session storage. We might store it in other places, but that's what we decided to go for here. And then we've used an interceptor so that we can send that in the header when we're making a request, and it was picked up, and you can see we can get in there. Still got a few more things to do. We've got to do a bit of error handling. We've got to have the ability to log out and things like that. But we'll look at those in the next video where we can see some more enhanced features. So I hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.